All right, I think we will get this presentation started. So thank you. Welcome to the webinar entitled Fishy Origins, What Canadian Seafood Labels Don't Tell You. My name is Christina Callegari. I am the Sustainable Seafood Coordinator at the Ecology Action Center, as well as your host and presenter for today. This webinar is going to be recorded. It is also on Facebook Live, so you will be able to watch it over again. But I would like to begin this presentation by acknowledging the fact that we're gathering online across Canada, it looks like so far, in various locations, but certainly in Nova Scotia here, we are on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. It's critical that we remember our relationship to this land. Most of us are visitors on this land, and we ask that you consider that as we continue today's webinar. I'd also like to let you know that my colleagues Hope Perez and Rowan Swain, who are at the EAC, are behind the scenes today. They're going to take care of all of the technical logistics, so thank you so much to both of them. If you have any issues, please let them know in the chat box and they'll be able to help you. As well, we are going to have a question period at the end of this webinar. And so at any time, you can put your questions in the Q&A box if you're on the webinar, and you can also add a question in the comments if you're on Facebook. My colleague, Liane Veitch, is going to be moderating the question period for us today. Liane is the National Manager for SeaChoice, which is the partnership that the Ecology Action Center does our seafood labeling and traceability work. So it's very fitting that she is here with us today as well. So welcome and thank you, Liane. So give me a second, I'm just going to get my presentation up and running and then we can get started. So I'm quickly going to go through what I'll be talking about in our presentation today. So I'm going to start by talking about a key element on a seafood label, that being the country of origin label. And I'm going to talk about what the issue is around it, as well as show a video. Additionally, I'm going to talk about Canada's poor labeling laws and talk about what a better label looks like. I'll also dive into why this information on a label is important, as well as talk about what traceability is and why that's also important. And then we're going to end the presentation with what you can do to help. So I'm going to start off by giving, again, a brief introduction to our labeling and traceability work, which is done through our partnership with the David Suzuki Foundation and Living Ocean Society. And together it forms the partnership SeaChoice. SeaChoice was founded in 2006, and we are an advocate and watchdog leading the next evolution of seafood sustainability in Canada. We do a variety of work, everything from improving retailer sustainability commitments to improving eco labels and eco certifications. We have a set of priority species that we work on to improve their fisheries and aquaculture management. But today, of course, I'm going to focus on our labeling and traceability work. So just before I show you this video, I am going to turn off my screen and show you some actual seafood products. So that I'd like you to sort of just consider as you watch the video. So if you've never really looked at a seafood label before, you might have not noticed that there's usually some text saying product of somewhere. And so this product that I have right here, it's wild Pacific cod fillets. And if you turn it around, it's a little bit small, but it says product of China. Okay, and then I also have another product. This is a package from some sardines in a can. It's actually a Canadian brand, but when you turn it around, you see some text that says it's a product of Poland. And then finally, I have a can of wild sockeye salmon. And when you turn this one around, at the very bottom here, it says it's a product of the USA. And so I want you to question for a moment, if you saw this in a grocery store, would you assume that the product of whatever country is where the fish was actually caught or farmed? And so now I'm going to turn it over to my presentation again, and hopefully the video will answer this question that I just posed. So I hope, oh, there we go. So I hope that you take away from that video the issue with the way that we label the country of origin in Canada and what we should be doing instead. So as a quick summary, in Canada, because we label our seafood based on where the seafood was processed versus where it was actually farmed or caught, we end up not knowing the true origin of our seafood. While some seafood is caught and processed in the same place, because our seafood industry is very global and complex in nature, usually those two places are not the same. So here again, I wanted to show some real life examples of some products. And in this case, I wanted to talk about specifically just the country of origin label. So this is a package that I saw the other night at Sobeys. It's a yellowfin steak, and here it simply just says product of Thailand. And so this would not be a good example of a country of origin label, but it is currently what is required in Canada. Whereas this product here is wild shrimp, and if you zoom in, you can see that they've actually identified that it was harvested in Argentina and processed in Vietnam. And so this would be a better example of a product that is accurately showing the country of origin. So just to take a step back to look at the issue more broadly, it's not just the country of origin label that is a problem here in Canada. This report card here, we had published with a report a few years ago, where we basically compared Canada's labeling standards to our major export partners, that being the US and the European Union. And as you can see, Canada got a failing grade, whereas the European Union is doing much better. They require much more on a seafood product label than we do. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through these elements a little bit more in detail and talk about why they are important. And just to note before I move on that in Canada, all we require, as you can see here, is the common name of the species of whatever is being sold and the country of origin, which we know is the country of processing. So after we published the report, SeaChoice came out with some voluntary labeling standards, what we would like to see as best practice labeling, and they're largely reflective of what the EU requires. So we have the actual geographic origin in addition to the country of origin, the scientific name in addition to the common name, the actual method of production, so whether it was farmed or wild, and then how it was caught or farmed, so the gear or the type of farming. And so now I'm going to get into why this information is important. So we've kind of already addressed why geographic origin is important, but I wanted to give a couple examples of why we would actually care where our seafood was caught or farmed. So a couple examples here that I wanted to show via some articles that came out last year. The first one is in relation to certain health risks. So shrimp, this was an article that came out last year that actually exposed some of the imported shrimps that were coming into Canadian grocery stores that actually had these so-called antibiotic resistant bacteria found on 17% of the shrimp tested, and over 50% of those positive cases were coming from India. And so in this case, consumers could choose to avoid those products until practices change or until import regulations are tightened, but our labeling doesn't allow us to make those decisions. Additionally, with environmental sustainability and how that connects with origin, this was another interesting article that came out last year with headlines saying that a fish and chip shop in the UK were selling endangered sharks. However, when they actually did some DNA tests, they found out that it was actually spiny dogfish that came from Canada. And although it's not the most sustainable choice, the population in Canada is not as threatened as a population of sharks in Europe. So in this case, origin certainly matters as well. So the next element that I want to talk about, is which species it actually is. So the reason that we encourage scientific name on a label is because every species usually only has one scientific name, whereas the common names that can be used for seafood can apply to many different species and can vary from region to region, culture to culture. This is a graphic here that also came out of the same report that we did where we looked at seafood labels. And so as you can see, you know, there's 100+ species that are allowed to be called rockfish under the CFIA guidelines. And so this is important because some rockfish, especially in the West Coast, are better managed and more sustainable than other populations of rockfish, and so, or other species of rockfish. So we want to know and differentiate which species those are. The next element that I want to talk about was knowing just whether was caught or farmed. So because aquaculture has grown so rapidly over the past while, we have a lot of products that are both farmed and wild that are the same. And so differentiating the method of production can help us to understand a little bit more about any sort of sustainability or social responsibility concerns. And then in addition to that, we also want to know how it was caught or farmed. So there's different gear types that are used for fishing that are more destructive to either a population of species or the actual marine environment than others. And then similarly with farming, there's some farming methods that are more sustainable than others when you think about the difference between land-based, which can be more sustainable, versus open net pen aquaculture. And so again, I wanted to give some more examples of some companies who are doing a better job with our labeling. So by no means are these perfect labels, but they're certainly on the right track. So this is one example of a label. It's cod. Because it gives the scientific name, we do know that it is Pacific cod. It also gives where it was caught, and it says that it's wild. The aspect that is missing in this one would be how it was caught, so what kind of gear was used. As well, this example here is another Pacific cod. It tells us where it was caught. It tells us the fishing zone. It tells us whether it tells us that it's wild. And the only criticism I would have with this one is that under type of fishing, it gives both trawl and long line. And so ideally we would just want one fishing method, not two. And then this is the last example of some tuna. So this label is great. It tells us the common name, the scientific name, the fishing zone, where it was caught in, that it was wild, and how it was caught. So now that you know a little bit about the issues with labeling and what makes a good label, I want to turn our attention towards traceability, as it's really the key tool that allows for correct and transparent labels of seafood. So traceability in its broadest definition is the tool used to track information about a product along the supply chain. And so traceability in itself is nothing new. For a very long time, it's been used sort of as an internal system that will help with things like health and safety, so like food recalls and whatnot. But now we've sort of shifted to use it in a new way. So we're using it for things like sustainability, for fisheries management. And so I want to go over what makes an effective traceability system. And that is, it starts tracing out the water. It uses a label or other physical identifier attached to the product that traces what it is, where it came from, how it was produced, as well as its movement throughout the supply chain. They maintain records and processes that make the data shareable and accessible and include independent verification. And it's also important to note that traceability is kind of along a spectrum. You can have a really basic traceability system that's internal, kind of just what we have in Canada right now, which is just a one up, one down system. So I know where the seafood that I bought came from, if I'm a distributor, for example, and I know who I sold it to. But what's come up now is moving towards these systems that are often termed as like a full chain traceability or boat to plate traceability, that's actually consumer facing, so that the consumers get this information as well. So traceability has a suite of benefits. I'm going to go over a few. So as I mentioned, it's important for health and safety. This is the way that it's usually been used, especially things like recalls. So being able to easily track back and figure out where a certain batch that might have gotten contaminated, for example. Traceability is one of the systems that will really help with that. Traceability can also help with access to markets. So it can help producers know where their product is going. It can help them in the end see actual payoff of their product that they're selling. Additionally, it can help businesses with their risk management. So especially right now in the global pandemic, we've seen some initial research that's come out that's shown that companies who already had a robust traceability system have mapped out their supply chain, know what's going on, were able to more easily and quickly adjust to crises such as the pandemic. Of course, traceability is important for environmental sustainability. A traceable label doesn't mean it's sustainable per se, but what it does is it provides information for us or buyers to determine if it is sustainable. It can also be really helpful for reducing mislabeling. So whether a product is mislabeled intentionally or not, having a label that's physically attached to the product all the way through the supply chain helps to reduce cases where information could get lost or tampered with or changed. And then finally, traceability is really critical for product legality. So we can make sure that the product wasn't associated with things like illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, as well as any human rights abuses. So right now we have a very unique opportunity to actually improve our labeling and traceability in Canada. As I said, our traceability standards are not what they should be to ensure accurate and detailed seafood labels. And so the government of Canada promised to develop a boat-to-plate traceability program. And so SeaChoice wants to make sure that they deliver on this promise. And so we set up a petition that is basically adding your voice to encourage and show that you have support for this promise to make sure that it goes forward. And so we would greatly appreciate your help in adding your voice to this petition. The more numbers we can get, the better to show that there is widespread support for this promise. So thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I'm happy to take some questions now if you have any.
Thanks, Christina. We've had a couple questions come in. One question came in from the Facebook Live viewer asking about fresh fish purchased at the fish counter and whether those kind of products have rules about origin labeling.
Yeah, so they would still be subject to the same country of origin labeling as any other product. That's a great question. The only, I guess, little stick with that is that in Canada, we only require a product of origin label when the product is imported. So if it's from Canada, if it's actually from Canada and hasn't been processed anywhere else, it likely just won't have a origin label at all. So that's one way that you might be able to know if it's from Canada, if there's unfortunately no product of origin label.
Okay, thanks. We also had another question come in through the Q&A, which was how products can be both farmed and wild caught.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, halibut, for example, can be caught in Nova Scotia, but it's also farmed. Things like different types of trout, so rainbow trout, we can catch in the wild, but we can also farm it. Arctic char would be another example that's caught up in the Arctic, but is often farmed on land. Those would be a few examples of, they're the same species, but they're both farmed and wild.
All right, great, thank you. We've had another Facebook question come in, which was whether there's any seafood in Canada that gets better traceability information. The person commented that they see a lot more information on live mussels and oysters, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in fact, there are more regulations for shellfish in Canada. So the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has put some extra regulatory rules towards shellfish, mostly because they're more subject to some health risks as opposed to other seafood. But yes, so on for example, like a bag of mussels that you might get or some oysters, you will see information showing, I think, the date of harvest, the location of the harvest, and whoever supplied those oysters have to have proper traceability in place already so that if there is an issue with the product, the retailer, for example, can go back and actually ask the producer to provide them with more information or a certain batch that was associated with the health concern. So we do see that it's already regulation for these species in Canada, which definitely gives us hope that this is something that can happen for all seafood products as well.
Thanks. On that theme of expanding traceability to other products and commodities, we have a question about whether it's always the case that more responsibly produced and labeled fish are more expensive, and whether there's resources out there to help people find seafood that is both responsible and affordable.
Yeah. So sometimes you will see that sustainable product is has a price premium. But that's not always the case, and there are some ways to get around that. In terms of resources and where you can look to get sustainable seafood, I'll say head to SeaChoice, our website. We have lots and lots of good resources to look into. Often we will suggest that if you don't want to do too much work to make a sustainable choice, eco certifications and eco labels are a great thing to look out for. So we recommend eco certifications like the Marine Stewardship Council or EAC. And if you've never seen the Marine Stewardship Council logo before, it's this blue one right here. While there are issues with eco certifications, SeaChoice does do a lot of work in trying to improve the standards that the eco certifications base their assessments on. So, but you can also look to recommendation programs like OceanWise, or it's a little bit more prevalent in the States, but Seafood Watch would be another one where they have the sort of green, yellow, red ranking. But in terms of getting a little bit more bang for your buck, I usually say to people, try to explore a diversity of seafood products. Sometimes you might not realize that some seafood, if it's not, you know, your typical salmon, cod, tuna, can be cheaper than other products. I always point people again towards shellfish, mussels, clams, oysters can be cheaper, and in my opinion, if they're farmed, they're probably the most sustainable choice that you can make. They actually have a net positive effect on the environment because they help clean the water. And again, in terms of trying to reduce cost a bit, if you can get your hands on a whole fish and you are comfortable with filleting or handling a whole fish, I think it's probably the best bang for your buck that you're going to get. You can basically just throw the whole fish in the oven, and you get a lot more meat from that product than you otherwise would. So those are a few tips, but yes, back to your question, sometimes you're going to be paying a bit more for a sustainable product, but that's also helping the producers who are you know, spending more time to make sure that products are sustainable or socially responsible.
Thanks, Christina. We've had a couple questions come in about eco certifications. Someone would like to know, what exactly does MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, mean? So they'd like to hear a bit more about that scheme. And then also, someone would love to get your perspective on which certifications are the best.
Okay, sounds good. So the Marine Stewardship Council, it's a non-government organization, and so they are a certifier for fisheries. So it's just wild capture. Aquaculture Stewardship Council is again similar to it, but it only focuses on farm seafood. So they have a standard for seafood globally, and they will assess different fisheries all around the world and basically say whether or not they are MSC certified or not. The fisheries or fishermen do have to apply and pay for this certification, but once they get the certification, they can then put the label on their product. And then again, to your question about what's the better eco-label, SeaChoice generally recommends MSC as sort of the gold standard for eco-labels. The big reason being they are third-party certified. and verified. So they have external auditors who do the certifications, which helps in the transparency and sort of like legitimateness of the program. As well, they have something called chain of custody, which is not necessarily traceability, but it helps to make sure that each actor within the supply chain that is MSC certified has to make sure that product is separate from other non-MSC certified products. So you make sure that what's on, if MSC is on a seafood product label, that that product did come from an MSC certified fishery.
All right, thanks, Christina. We've had one more question about MSC come in, which is from a local lobster fisher who says that they have to get MSC certification in order to sell their product to Europe. And they're wondering whether Canada requires this as well.
So no, Canada does not require any certain certification for product to be imported at the moment. And I don't believe there is any plan to. We actually don't really have any sort of import regulations like the EU and the US. The US recently put in a seafood import monitoring program, and so they require for certain species a certain level of traceability, and same with the EU as well, but currently Canada does not.
All right, thanks. We've had a question from Marlene about how difficult it is to work with international bodies and corporations to get the information that would improve our ability to label seafood products adequately.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is difficult, especially because seafood is so globalized, and so it's tough, of course, to get that information from all parties. There are some great initiatives, such as the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability. That's a global dialogue that's working with industry to be more collaborative and to work towards more traceability within the supply chain. So that's one area where industry is working to improve those situations where it is tough to get some information. Again, though, with regulations, if we did have tighter import regulations in Canada, that would help to ensure that product coming into Canada did have the proper labeling, because it would be required for import.
All right, thanks. And we've had another question in from Jackie, which is also about access to information about the product we're buying. And they would like to know how consumers can know that farm salmon is farmed. So what are the rules around method of production for products like salmon?
Yeah, so we don't require, as I said, for a product to be labeled as farmed. Because largely the type of salmon that is farmed is Atlantic salmon. A good way to know if your product is farmed or not, if it says Atlantic salmon or if it just says salmon, it's likely going to be Atlantic salmon, and it's likely going to be farmed, because there are some farms for other species of salmon, but overall Atlantic salmon is the most farmed salmon species in Canada, and what we also get in through our imports. So I would say assume it's farmed, especially if it doesn't say wild, because usually there's some more incentive for someone to say that the salmon is wild. And we cannot commercially fish and sell Atlantic salmon. So if it is Atlantic salmon, it's going to be farmed. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's also the point that all of the Pacific salmon species, which are the ones that are typically wild caught, have to be labeled with a specific species name. So if it doesn't say something like sockeye salmon, Chinook salmon, pink salmon, etc., if it just says salmon, that's an acceptable common name only for Atlantic salmon.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks.
Which is another good supermarket hack.
Yes.
We've had a question come in from Facebook asking about a lobster tracing program for fishermen around Nova Scotia and PEI. The person commented that they really enjoyed being able to track your dinner from boat and crew to plate, but it seemed to have been short-lived. Do you know anything about this program and why it was stopped?
I think I know what you're referring to. This was a pilot project. I think it was started in maybe 2014, 2015, from a company called This Fish. And so, yeah, it was a great initiative. I think it expanded out towards Sobeys as well. I'm not quite sure why it ended. It might have just been because at the time there was not enough demand, or possibly resources ran out to continue the program. But yeah, that's what it was, and it was a great program, and I'm happy to hear that you appreciated the boat to plate traceability that it offered.
Right, thanks. And just to say to everyone, thanks for the great questions and keep them coming. We've got one more question queued up right now, which is that mussels and oysters are great, but people also like to eat fish. Are there farmed species other than salmon you'd recommend people can get in the grocery store? So what to look for in terms of farm species that's not salmon?
Yeah, if you're looking for something that has a similar flavor profile to salmon, I always point people towards rainbow trout or Arctic char. Arctic char is fantastic if you've never tried it before, and a lot of the trout that's farmed in Canada, but also in Europe, is land-based for both Arctic char and rainbow trout. I have seen rainbow trout and Arctic char occasionally in grocery stores around here. It might depend where you are, depends where you might be around and across Canada. But those are some great options for farm options. Other options, it may take a little bit more digging. I mean, tilapia is a really big one that's kind of exploded over the past few years as being a cheaper farm species, but you have to be really careful about where it's coming from. If you look under the Seafood Watch assessments for tilapia, there's a ton that are green, yellow, and red, so it's one that's a little bit more difficult to figure out. But tilapia is great because they are they do feed on plants as opposed to being carnivorous, so feeding on other organisms, and so generally the farming is a little bit more sustainable because you don't have to use other wild species to feed the fish.
Thanks. Would you recommend, we've had someone suggest sablefish. Would you recommend sablefish as a?
Yes, especially I'm on the East Coast, so I don't get sablefish very often, but yes, if you're in BC, sablefish is a great option.
Great, thank you. We've also had a bit more information come through about the This Fish pilot project, because EAC helped start that, but I think it was before your time. So one of your colleagues has gotten in touch to say that so much of the East Coast lobster is exported to Asia, to Europe, to the United States. It's about 85% of the lobster production, that the fishermen who were involved in the This Fish trial were finding that they just couldn't get the premium prices or enough local commitment to differentiate their product from producers who weren't doing that additional traceability. So unfortunately, in the end, it came down to economics in that case. But hopefully also there's been, much greater, an increase in awareness of consumers about the value of these kinds of products. So hopefully we'll be able to see something more about that. Had a couple more questions come in. Someone is asking about, when it comes to buying seafood in restaurants, would we be able to see some of this traceability information available to restaurant goers? And I'm going to add, what about labeling in restaurants? Can you say a bit about that?
Thank you. That's a great question. So yes, we would hopefully want traceability in the same way for both restaurants and retailers. There's definitely been some initiatives that have shown that it's possible. A lot of chefs can provide QR codes to restaurant goers, and you can simply just scan it on your phone and find out more about your meal. Labeling is especially more difficult, and often there's a lot more mislabeling within restaurants because it's so easy for restaurants to just, throw everything in a chowder, for example, and not label it either correctly or accurately. And so, yes, so we think that it's critical for restaurants to also have a certain level of traceability and proper labeling on their menus. It can get a little bit difficult, especially with the restaurants who often turn over their restaurants if they have a lot of seasonal food, but it's definitely doable, and we'd hope that the CFIA would include restaurants in this promise that they've committed to, that being the boat to plate traceability promise. So yes, hopefully we can get the same amount of traceability in restaurants as well.
Thanks, Christina. We've had a question in from Di about labeling more than traceability, and they comment that they like buying frozen at sea seafood because they believe it is actually fresher than fresh seafood, which has been kept unfrozen for a few days between being caught and ending up at the market. So they can only label never frozen seafood as fresh, but you have to label frozen at sea seafood as previously frozen. And they're wondering whether this confuses consumers and whether you have any thoughts on this labeling requirement.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone tell me that it is confusing, but I do expect that that is a confusing labeling requirement for consumers, especially I see this a lot with the fresh case. Everything's always previously frozen, so yes. And then what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Whether you have any thoughts on the fresh versus previously frozen aspects. I'm going to add, in terms of sustainability, do you have any thoughts on the sustainability of fresh products, as in never frozen, and previously frozen products?
Yeah, definitely. So we often say that fresh is better than frozen, although for a long time that hasn't been sort of the mentality with people who think that fresh is always better. Frozen can be better in a lot of ways. So oftentimes, if it's like you said, if it's frozen at sea, it's fantastic because it is fresher, and our freezing technologies have advanced so much over the past years that there really isn't that much of a difference. And I agree, it is usually a lot fresher. Carbon footprint can be lower sometimes if it's frozen, and yeah, and there's the sort of like the waste issue that's tied into this this issue as well. So if product is frozen and in individual packets, people are generally, and within the supply chain, there's going to be less waste. So because seafood can go bad in literally days, it's definitely one of the food products on the market that spoil the quickest. Having it frozen and available throughout the supply chain and to consumers definitely helps to reduce that as well, because food waste is another big issue as well, not just with seafood, but with food in general. So yes, definitely agree. Frozen is a lot of the time a lot better.
Great, thank you. We've had a comment in from one of our viewers, from Jackie, about the fact that they've heard that scallops are often mixed with skate wing as the texture is similar and can absorb the scallop flavor, but is cheaper. So kind of making that into a broader issue, do you have any recommendations for people who are worried about whether what they're buying, about the verifiability, I guess, of what they're buying, especially if it's something like scallop? It is a premium product, you're paying a lot for it. So do you have any tips for people in terms of how they can be confident that they're actually getting the species that they're paying for?
Yeah, so I mean, my one main tip would say if you can, try buying locally. When you buy locally, you're usually more connected with the producer themselves or someone who's maybe just one step down from the supply chain and would be able to give you that kind of information. And so what I'd ask for is the scientific name if they can give it to me, or if they just say it's scallops, ask what kind of scallops. Are they bay scallops, Atlantic scallops? And again, also, where did they come from? Those are some key pieces of information that we don't always get on the label, but if you're able to, even just at your retailer, just at like the fresh counter, ask those questions, because oftentimes, I mean, I've been at the grocery store, I've seen products that were labeled generically, like maybe sole would be a good example, and I simply just ask the whoever is cutting or packaging your fish for you, just ask those specific questions, and sometimes they will be able to give it to you. They might have to run to the back to figure out what it could be, but asking those questions really help. Restaurants, a lot of the time, waiters sometimes know. They might also need to ask someone else, but definitely asking the questions help. It also shows demand for that information as well, which will hopefully, tell the retailer or the restaurant that you want to know this information, and then maybe next time you go to the grocery store, that information could be on there.
Thanks. Yeah, and if you're interested in that kind of information, that SeaChoice has been running kind of citizen scientist experiment where we mail out DNA testing kits to consumers across Canada, and then they go to their local supermarket and they buy seafood, take a sample, and send it into the lab at the University of Guelph, and they test whether it is the species that it said on the pack. It's a very cool project. We're going to be kicking off our 3rd year of testing this fall, so keep an eye out for that. We've had a question from Jess about whether you'd say the food waste from fresh product, basically the question about the trade-off between the environmental impacts of potential food waste with fresh products versus the additional plastic waste that comes with frozen products.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that I often grapple over, because, for example, this package that had fish in it, it came in individual packages. So there was like, I think it was 6 different fillets in this package that were all individually packaged. So yes, that's a decent amount of waste that you're going to get. So it kind of depends on the product. I mean, if you're just looking at, let's say, like whitefish fillets, for example, you might want to check if it's between, if you're sort of between, I don't know, haddock at the fresh counter or haddock that's frozen in individual fillets. If the haddock is local, like if you're from the East Coast, then you'd hope, if there is no country of origin label saying that it's from somewhere else, that it's been shipped to get processed, for example, the carbon footprint would essentially be lower in that case. So in that case, maybe choosing the fresh option would be better. And then again, it might depend on the product. Not all frozen products that are in the frozen case are as packaged. So yes, that's a really good question, something that I'm often going back and forth between. You can also, I don't think that this is the case currently with the pandemic, but there were a couple of grocery stores, I think earlier or last year, that were starting to say you could bring your own containers to get fresh product, which was a really cool idea, because either way, you're still going to get packaging with the fresh product as well. But if you were able to bring your own container, that would also help with reducing waste.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. Hopefully they'll start that up again.
Hopefully.
We've had another question come in from Facebook saying that when they lived in Halifax, there was an Off the Hook project, which paired consumers to fisher folk so they knew how much to catch each week, and then they'd get a whole fish. This person is really hoping that that program could make a comeback. what do you think it would take to make a program like that viable?
Yeah, that was a great question. And so my colleagues before my time worked on that community supported fishery, and from what I know, it was a great success. Unfortunately, what happened with that was that, well, there's a bunch of factors, but the difficulty, and this kind of goes back to the this fish traceability example, is that it just wasn't economically viable. And so it's awesome to have that local product, but it's really about creating these systems, especially on a local level, that allow for that kind of product to be sold. There's a lot of unnecessary regulatory barriers that you can come up against for processors who want to sell their product locally, especially with having to have like a processing license. The community supported fishery, if you remember, it was mostly whole fish, and that's because the local fishermen weren't able to sell it. But yes, I do hold hope that we can have more community supported fisheries like that, because I as well would like some local fish in Halifax. There also are some fishmongers here that you can check out if you're sort of missing that. Aficionado Fishmongers is also really great as well. I think I answered your question. Liane, did I miss anything?
I think you got it. I'll just
Okay.
add that there is another community supported fishery company called Skipper Auto, and I'll drop their link in the chat box. And they have pickup locations in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. So if you're interested in community supported fisheries, you can check them out if you live in one of those places. Otherwise, you might be able to find a local fishmonger or distributor who, especially with the pandemic, has switched from supplying restaurants and food service to direct consumer sales.
Yeah.
I've been doing it in Vancouver, and it has been great.
Yeah, and I'll also mention, my colleague just reminded me that we actually have a report coming out soon about the community supported fishery that we had in Halifax. It's going to talk about all the successes and challenges and go into a lot more detail that that I won't be able to provide today, but stay tuned for that. It will be coming out soon.
Yeah, thanks. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap this up? You guys have been a really great audience, really good questions, and a great discussion. So if there's no final questions, Christina, there's been a lot of thank yous coming in. So you've done a great job, and I think everyone's learned a lot. Even I've learned a few things, and this is my bread and butter and has been for years.
Great.
So I'll just leave it to you to sign off.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all the questions and comments and thank yous. I hope you really enjoyed this, and I am very happy to provide the information, and I hope it was helpful to you. So again, this webinar is going to be recorded. I believe it will be posted on our Ecology Action Facebook page in a few days, so you can rewatch if you like. And yeah, have a fabulous day, and thank you so much again for attending.